All right, says we're live.
And we are live today for the first time ever. I've been watching him from afar for 2 years now, going, one day I'm going to get this man on my channel and I'm going to be so happy. We have the eminence, his eminence, Paul Vanderklay, brought YouTube, not that new of a YouTuber, relatively new YouTuber extraordinaire, Peterson-Expert, and John Vervaeke expert. And hopefully we'll be covering all those bases. He may have even met both of them, I believe. Welcome, John. You want to introduce, or welcome, Paul. You want to introduce yourself?
Well,
Paul,
my name.
Paul,
Yeah. Well, my name is Paul Vanderklay, and I do make YouTube videos. And I have not met either. I've met Jordan Peterson in the flesh. I've shaken his hand a few times. Met John Vervaeke only over the internet, and John and I have actually had more substantive conversations than I've had with Jordan. So, but I'm a pastor of a local church. I started making YouTube videos because I figured people didn't read books. And
we don't.
Then,
we definitely don't. Books are for nerds.
Yeah.
YouTube is where it's at.
Yeah. So, and because it was just dumb luck, I suppose. Calvinists shouldn't say such things. That my YouTube videos about Jordan Peterson got some traction, and then a following happened, and I've been doing meetups, and my YouTube channel is just kind of a thinking out loud channel, and then having conversations with just about anybody. So that's sort of what I do.
Yes, I've noticed that there's a couple of things about your YouTube channel. First off, I'll just give you a background on us with Vervaeke before I start. We have a Vervaeke chat group, me, John, and one of the guys, I believe, what's his name? One of the guys I believe was on. He streamed with you a couple of times. He was involved in cults or something. He's been on your channel.
Oh, Nick.
Yes, Nick. Nick streams with us.
Oh, wonderful.
I was thinking
Nick's
Brett.
great.
Brett's the other guy. Yeah, really smart guy. He's in the group, and this other guy Brett, who I don't believe you know. But we stream once a week when we're going through the whole meaning crisis.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes. The other thing is I don't think it was luck so much as you seem to get it right in streaming about Jordan Peterson right at the beginning of the Jordan Peterson wave, as far as I can tell, right?
Yeah, timing was really good for me.
Right. I mean, right when when he was starting, I remember about 2 years ago, I was online with Twitter dealing with atheists, and I was shopping Peterson around to them, and nobody had heard of him at that point. And I was like, you atheists, you guys will probably like him because he was more, he's more scientific. He's more, I figured that the atheists would actually appreciate his approach to Christianity. And at that point, nobody had heard of him. And that was probably right about when you started, 6 months later, he's basically a household name in our area.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you do, Craig? I don't know hardly anything about you.
Well, I just I'm on Twitter doing apologetics. I started this up about 3 years ago.
Okay.
Kind of randomly. I just started a Twitter feed and just started interacting with atheists, and then it just kind of led to one thing. I was like, maybe I should start a YouTube channel. Then I started a YouTube channel, and then I got like a couple of well-known atheists right at the beginning to interview, and so I've just been doing this for about, I guess, 2 years. There's kind of a community of people who do this that I'm a part of.
Okay.
You probably know some of them. So now you're a pastor. You were a pastor for a long time, correct?
I was ordained in 1991.
Right. And so tell us about your church. You started a church?
I didn't start a church. I was ordained in 91, and I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic for about 7 years. And then I moved to Sacramento, California. The church was existent. They called me. In the Christian Reformed Church, pastors are sort of like free agents, and Christian Reformed churches can call them. So I was called to this church, and I've been at this church since 97. And yeah, it's a small church. It's extremely diverse. It's aging. It's aging quite quickly. It's the core of the group that started in the early 60s is now obviously up there in age. The neighborhood is a struggling neighborhood in what used to be suburban California, just kind of dilapidated suburbs now. And I've been here now 22 years, and I
Wow.
do what I do in my little church.
And you started noticing, you started becoming interested in streaming because you got interested in Jordan Peterson first, because you saw how it could apply to you, like you were something about his approach, or how'd that happen?
I had been curious about the potential for YouTube before that.
Right.
I had used Hangouts on the Air to record sermons so that people could see them. And it's just, looking for a no-cost way to record sermons so that if someone missed a Sunday and they heard about a sermon, I could say, well, give them a YouTube link and they'd find it. And
Right.
then so really my first show on YouTube was the Freddie and Paul show, where Freddie is a member of my church, and he comes up to me. He had done public access TV stuff. He likes to rap. And he said to me one day, Pastor, you and I should do a TV show. And it's like, I said, I'll tell you what, Fred, I'll use my smartphone and we'll make little, 5-minute shows where you can rap and we can talk about sports and do whatever you want to. And that'll be our show. So I did that for about a year before I did anything with Jordan Peterson.
Rap as in, here's a little story about a brother like me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's what Freddie does. If you haven't watched the Freddie and Paul show, you should watch it. There's a whole bunch of them on my channel. And
right,
so
kick it, go for it. All right.
I had blogged for years. So I'm a pastor of a small church, but
right.
interested in following the culture. And, being a minister, you're always trying to take the Bible and whatever the world is now and sort of fit them together for the sake of, the people of the church.
Making it
And
relevant.
so I had blogged for years. And then I thought more and more I was finding video content that I was interested in, but that didn't really mesh with the blog format. So I wanted to figure out how I could, in a sense, blog about stuff I was finding in video format. And so I was thinking about that. And then Jordan Peterson came up and I was blogging about him, but that didn't feel quite right. And so I thought, I'll make a video and see what happens. I figured maybe 100 people would watch it and I'd gain 2 or 3 interesting conversation partners, and that would be it. But that wasn't it. And everything else has happened since then.
Yeah. Now, have you actually streamed with Peterson himself? Joined him on a stream?
So Jordan Peterson was giving half-hour Patreon conversations, and somebody gave me one of his. And so I had a half-hour conversation with Jordan as a Patreon call.
Oh, cool.
And that was April of 2018.
So that was right before the Jordan Peterson wave started growing.
Yeah, I found him, I did my first video about Peterson in November of 2017, and C16 was October of 2016. So he had been growing. And when I subscribed, he had about 300,000 subs on his YouTube channel.
Right. Now he's got what, 1 million or something like that?
A couple million.
Oh, is it a couple million at this point?
It's
now,
over 2
so
million.
you started doing your channel. It's not necessarily a Peterson channel, but it kind of sort of is. How would you describe your channel? It's you have a lot of different wheels, like a lot of different irons in the fire with what you're trying to do with your channel. But how would you describe it?
My channel is functions kind of how my blog used to function. My blog functioned as, pastors. So when I was in seminary, really before the internet was anything, pastors would have file cabinets full of newspaper clippings. And this is how pastors would keep in touch with the culture, compile sermon illustrations, things like this. Now, when the internet came along, very quickly, keeping files full of clippings didn't make much sense. So I was always looking for ways to archive information. Eventually, I settled just on having a blog where I could find things, put links in, and keep things. But then I also found that I used the blog as sort of a conversation partner, where I could think out loud about things. And so I'd put disclaimers on my blog just because I post something doesn't mean I endorse it. Everything I read in my blog it's just off the top of my head. I'm thinking out loud because I'm a pastor of a small church, and who am I going to talk to? Most of the people in the church aren't interested in a lot of the weird, nerdy things I am. So my blog was a thinking partner, and my YouTube channel really is the same thing. And except sometimes I have people like what you and I are doing right now, where we're talking together. So we're thinking together. But my monologue videos, as I call them, or my commentary videos, I'm just thinking out loud. And so I was really surprised that anybody would care to watch what in many ways is just part of my.
Well, you kind of got a perfect mix, because you're a traditional pastor, but you're also obviously pretty well read, or maybe even very well read. And you kind of right in the type of perfect wheelhouse for YouTube. And your channel's pretty good. Your channel, you put out a lot of content that's usually like, right in the wheelhouse of stuff that almost everybody that I know is interested in. You know what I mean? Touching on all the people who most people find are relevant: Tom Holland, Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson. I thought you had a thing that was more dedicated towards Peterson. Do you have some sort of group that's dedicated specifically towards him?
Well, so when my channel took off, people in Sacramento started contacting me, and they'd float into my church, but my church was kind of weird to them. So, they'd say, well, why don't we start a meetup? And it's like, oh, okay. What could, I figured I'd waste $80 on meetup.com. 3 people would show, and within 3 months it would be dead.
Right.
That's not what happened. A dozen people showed the first time, and almost always new people continue to come. And so we started doing meetups, and what I discovered in the meetup was I had always wanted church to be sort of like a meetup. In the book of Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, Paul has in the book of Acts, actually, it's described. But when Paul was in Corinth, he rented out this hall, the Hall of Tyrannus, and he would just sort of, do lectures and stuff like that. And I would imagine Paul's talking, because if you read about him in the book of Acts, he's a Renaissance man, very well read, engaged with thinkers of his time. And so I'd always been frustrated too, because people in church don't tell the truth, at least not as the truth as they see it. And they're saying things that are doctrinally correct, even if they have doubts about it or don't believe it. They're afraid of speaking the truth because they'll lose status. And what happened in the meetup was mostly atheists and people who don't go to church would come to the meetups, and they would speak their mind. And that's really refreshing, because it means you can actually have a meaningful conversation with people about, and eventually conversations would go towards religious topics or philosophical topics. We try to stay away, from politics, as that tends to be a dead end. And I was finding that at these meetups, we're just having great conversations together. And I'm thinking, this is what I've always wanted a church small group to be like. And there it was.
Yeah. So you found your niche. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I've made the same observation. That's a lot of apologists do the same thing. They will tell you what they think they're supposed to believe, or tell you what they think they're supposed to say. And church people do it all the time, as opposed to what they actually believe. And what they actually really, honest to God, in their heart of hearts believe.
Right.
So yes, I totally agree. Now, how would you've streamed with Vervaeke, correct?
Yeah, John and I have had a number of conversations.
And what do you think about his project? Have you watched any of his Meaning Crisis series?
Oh yeah, I've watched them all.
Okay, good. So yeah, so have I.
Many of them a number of times.
A lot. The people who I stream with, one of the guys is an atheist. The other guy, Nick, there's another guy. They seem to think, or at least one of them said, that he's better than Jordan Peterson. Like, it's in the same wheelhouse of kind of a secular, how would you describe the wheelhouse this is for people who don't know these two? It's, you know, exploring spirituality and religion and things like that in secular terms and scientific terms. What would you say?
Well, John is a cognitive scientist, and I think at heart, he is seeking truth, beauty, what the Hebrews would call shalom. Now, he's in many ways, we would describe him as post-Christian. I think he's also post-Buddhist. And so in some ways, I see his project as similar to mine. Now, he's a university professor, and so instead of doing sermons like I do on Sunday, he does lectures. And but I think he's asking the deep questions about what does it mean to be a human being? What is truth? What matters? I see him asking those questions and pursuing that. And I respect that. Now, he isn't a Christian the way I am or Jonathan Peugeot, but he's certainly a good faith conversation partner. And he, I think, has developed a lot of language which is potentially accessible. Now, his language is rather difficult, as Job, friend of mine, Job says, fancy vervaeke words. His language tends to be,
yeah.
His
You got
language
to kind of
tends
know
to,
the dialogue.
yeah,
Agent
tends-
arena relationship.
yeah. But it's, you know, it's, at least he's in a sense trying to do this out in a public space. And so part of the difficulty that Christians have is that to a certain degree, if the church is successful, its people will have been so colonized by Christian language and the language of their tradition that they can live comfortably at home in it. Now, that's both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because for them and their community, they have what they need to exist and survive and endure. But it's not terribly helpful for people outside the church because Christians then all just revert to their version of Christianese, and they
totally.
can't have.
I used the term Christianese a couple of times in my videos, and a couple of atheists noticed the word and didn't quite get what I meant. You know, yes, Christianese is exactly what it is, where you start talking that God speak that alienates people who aren't in the fold. They don't really get what you're talking about. And it's not, if you're not saying it in secular terms, they might even be able to, I mean, part of what I do is try to translate everything I say into language that secular people can easily understand, because a lot of the faith talk just doesn't translate, even though they might get the concept.
Right.
You know, that's kind of what John Vervaeke is about. He's exploring the concepts of religion or spirituality and chiseling it into a more precise scientific exploration, I guess is how I would say it.
Yeah, well, his project is even more ambitious than that. I mean, his project is audacious in its scope. It's far too large of a project for one individual or even one generation, but it is connected to my project because what the church has to do, and actually has been remarkably successful in doing, is in fact connecting diverse cultures and generations to Jesus Christ in the world. That is the job of the church. And I look at what John is trying to do, and it's like, wow, that's big. And so
that's big, yeah.
And so, more power to him. And John and I are, we very much understand that we disagree on some foundational things, but I think it's helpful to bear witness to the fact that people can have good faith conversations across some of these lines. Now, I think Jordan's project was different.
Okay, go ahead.
Jordan, I think, saw himself as something of a prophet and a guru who was going to improve the lives of individuals in a very concrete and practical way to whatever degree his reach, to whatever degree he could reach out to people. And I think he was unbelievably successful in that. But he wasn't attempting to construct for them an entire inhabitable order in the sense that John's project and especially some of his partners are attempting to pursue. So in that sense, Jordan's project and John's project they've got some overlap. They're in some ways parallel, but immediately when I began listening to Jordan Peterson, I noted he was not really trying to build an institution. And by institution, I don't just mean a 501c3 or something with a name on it, but as John Vervaeke is, a set of practices, a community. I mean, that's what John's
right.
trying
Is
to
John
do.
Vervaeke is trying to build a religio of without religion.
Yes.
A secular monastery type movement where he wants to build an actual. You don't believe in God. He's taken it as a precept that God doesn't exist. He seems to be an atheist, but he's very comfortable with spirituality. But you replace all of the things that religion is giving you. You analyze what religion is actually given to people, and then you replace it all without God. That's
he's non-theistic, which is different from atheistic. And so if you listen to his stuff, that's an important distinction. And that's, that's not new to John. There's Beyond Theism was a CBC radio program in Canada. You can still find it in podcast version. And so a lot of the things that John has been working on, many others have been working on similar things.
Yeah. Okay. But that's the scope of what he's trying to do, right? Yes, he's trying to take all those trends and formalize them, put them into an actual structure.
Yes, and help people. So again, John is a university professor, but in many ways he's also, in a sense, I see John Peterson and myself have some similarities in that in some senses we're all preachers. Now John Vervaeke more in a sense of he's a practitioner. So he just did a video on meditation and he's talking to Guy Sengstock about his circling practice. And he's in dialogue with the men's movement that Rebel Wisdom is really connected with. So in that sense, John is analogous to me in that he is a practitioner. He's a practitioner of sorts.
Right. And you're a preacher in the traditional sense. You're trying to ultimately route this all back to the revelation of Jesus Christ, having more Jesus in your life, becoming more of a practicing Christian. The similarity between you and these two guys tends to be the open-mindedness. You're more open-minded in your approach than most theists would generally be. That's what I would see the similarity as. I don't know how you see the similarity.
People say that of me. I'm not quite sure what they mean, because I just do things like I do. And people will often say, well, but for a pastor, you're different. And I think, I know lots of pastors who are as open as I am and still committed to Christian orthodoxy. I haven't found, I
get what they mean. It's a compliment. I know
it's a compliment. I take it as such.
Right. It's not even a backhanded compliment, because if you take some of the public preachers, they're very automatic and knee jerk. Like they would never deal with someone like John Vervaeke. They wouldn't get it. They wouldn't see how it's sympathetic to theism in a deep way, because they wouldn't give it the time of day to actually understand that. Like one of the guys in our group is an atheist, and he said it's helped him become a lot less of an anti-theist, because he kind of starting to understand some of the mechanics of spirituality and religion and, the science and things like that, and how narrative is important. Thematically, he's similar to Jordan Peterson. They latch onto some of the same ideas. But in terms of overall project and vision, no, I would say you're a traditional pastor who happens to be making use of the tools that you find available to yourself. Is that kind of what?
That's exactly right. And I just did a podcast with some friends in Tucson where, I kept emphasizing, people are like, well, why do you do this? And it's like, I'm doing what pastors do. I'm just doing it on YouTube.
Right.
And now it's also significant, if I had a church of thousands of people, if I was running some big evangelical parachurch organization, I probably couldn't do what I do.
Right.
Because, I would say something wrong, but at this point in my career, I pastor an unimportant church. We don't have a magazine. We barely have a website, and so but I still, and so that's why I keep emphasizing to people, I am a pastor, and what I am doing in front of you and inviting you to do with me is think out loud honestly. If you don't believe in God, however you conceptualize that, say so and tell me what you do believe in, and let's talk about it. Because in my position, of course, I do believe in God. I do believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And so I'm not afraid of having conversations with people. I mean, I think Christians should be the most free to tell the world about our doubts, our beliefs, our suspicions, our fears, because finally, I am not saved by the rightness of my thinking or my capacity to fully implement my beliefs. I am saved by a God who sent his son to die for me. How much more secure can I be? So that's why I can be open and free and share all of my messiness with the world. Or not all of it. All of it that's appropriate.
Yeah. Hopefully not all of it. Don't give us too much information there, Paul. But yeah, amen. Amen to what you just said. I'm totally down with that. Now, how do you see Jonathan Pageau? You kind of explained him to me and helped me understand him a little better. He's kind of radical in his thought process, but he's also very orthodox in his practice. Is this true? Am I getting that right? Is that
Jonathan Pageau is so conservative, people can't recognize him as such.
Okay, so that's the radicalness. It's like
Yes.
a truly committed conservative appears like he's like the Edmund Burke of nowadays. He's totally go ahead.
There on my channel, there's a couple of conversations with a guy named Nathan Jacobs, who is making movies, but he actually got a PhD from Calvin Seminary, where I have my MDiv from.
Right.
Very interesting guy, but what people don't understand about the Orthodox Church is that the point of the Orthodox Church is that they don't change.
Yes.
They don't change, and they're serious about it. And that's what people don't get. And so Jonathan Pageau is an artist, and so he is trying to do art in continuity with the unchanging nature of the church. But now he is also obviously conversant in philosophy, because artists are deeply philosophical if they're good artists. And so what Jonathan he's not only a good artist, he's also articulate. And so what he's able to do is talk about these connections. And so, it's fascinating. It's fascinating what has gone on around Jonathan Pageau. And in fact, may be more fascinating and more important than what happened with Jordan Peterson or even John Vervaeke. It's incredible what is happening around Pageau.
Why more fascinating and important?
Because in a sense, with Jonathan Pageau, you have something like a church father who is conversant in English and our contemporary culture. And so what John is trying to do is translate between
like
these
the
two
Joker,
worlds.
Right. The Joker, he'll do streams on Santa Claus, the Joker, I forget how many 50 different things that he'll latch onto that's really like contemporary. And then I guess what you're saying is go really deep in a philosophically pure, theologically pure way that to the untrained person, we might not even recognize as theologically pure.
I don't know if I would say pure. I would say, he might say pure. I would say old, because a lot of it depends on whether or not, a lot of it depends on what progressive revelation means.
Okay.
Because in many ways, what happens if you want to understand the Protestant church tries to modulate Christians are always trying to maintain a narrative thread. Every religion does.
Right.
So you have the scriptures, you have the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus comes along and reinterprets the Hebrew scriptures in the light of that revelation. And that's what the New Testament is. Read a book like the book of Revelation, where I spent 75 weeks with my Sunday school class on the book of Revelation. And my conclusion about what that book is basically an attempt to modulate the Old Testament, considering Jesus Christ, obviously in an apocalyptic format, apocalyptic genre. But that's what the New Testament is. And what the Orthodox Church attempts to do is not lose that New Testament framework. But now there's a lot of discussion to the degree that, to what degree have other influences impacted the Orthodox Church. Now, Protestantism, in a sense, just says, okay, we're all in the stream and we've got to swim together. So they modulate in different ways. And it's really hard for Americans to understand the Orthodox Church because it hasn't been here that long.
It hasn't been in America that long.
Right.
It's the rock upon you, Peter, upon you I built this rock, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And it's timeless. What I think you're describing is it's trying to be true, completely true to its sacred traditions. And these traditions are timeless and they don't change. And
right.
in some senses, that's even the comfort of the Roman Catholic Church. I don't know how you feel about Roman Catholicism.
Well, they're parallel in that sense. But what's interesting between them is, of course, the Roman Catholic Church grows up in the West with Latin as their base language, and the Orthodox Church grows in the East with Greek as its base language. But that then adds to the deep question of Christianity, which is, can religions work in translation? Jews say no, Muslims say no, Mormons, in a sense, almost say no. Not really, because of their prophetic tradition, but Protestants say yes. And it's really complicated, and that's why Jonathan is such an interesting figure on the landscape, because I don't think people fully appreciate what the movement around him means. It's terribly interesting.
Could you liken it, when you're talking, I keep thinking of like a really, really like committed to the blues, down south blues man who learns to play like Georgia Delta blues, and it's totally in his soul. And to like the modern world, he strikes everyone as like the most radical, like forward thinking, progressive, like, avant-garde artist. But all he's doing is just pure digging into the tradition and totally embodying it,
right,
and purifying it.
Right. But it's also important to recognize that he's someone who comes into the tradition as an adult. And that's different from, let's say, someone who grew up, let's say, in the Orthodox Church and then immigrates to America. Like I had a conversation with a guy in one of my sister churches who grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church and then is going to this sister church of mine, a CRC church in one of our suburbs here. And that particular church is really trying to blend a lot of the tradition, as Protestants often do. But this person growing up in the Greek Orthodox Church really likes that, because they're also trying to modulate the Greek heritage and faith that they grew up with now being a California suburban. So all of these different cultural things are in play. And so Jonathan, being a French Canadian who spent some really formative time both in the university and in Africa, he's just got to be one of the more interesting people to me out there, partly because I'm also someone who is fascinated by culture.
Was he in Africa? Was he doing missionary work?
Yes, he was a missionary with the Mennonite Central Committee, I think.
Did you do missionary work?
Yes,
For what?
for the Christian Reformed World Missions.
For a year or two, or
No, I went there in 90 and I left in 97.
oh wow, where was there?
That was Dominican Republic.
Oh wow, okay. Now, what about the people who come to your Jordan Peterson meet and greets? I'm guessing that a chunk of them are atheists, correct?
Yes.
And how do you see going on here with the Jordan Peterson phenomenon? Not necessarily his cult of personality part, but like how he's impacted the dialogue, let's say. Like the Sam Harris, let's start with the Sam Harris debate. Did you watch those debates? I'm
Yes.
assuming you did.
Yes. There's a lot of
And-
commentary on them.
Yeah. So what are some of your pearls of wisdom from you having observed those debates?
I think so what happened with Charles Darwin was that Charles Darwin initiated a consensus of skepticism nested within the positivism of the 19th century. That sounds terribly philosophical.
No, we can just clarify it for people listening. I'm pretty sure I get almost what you mean. That he, go ahead.
Well, before Charles Darwin, Christians regularly were positing evolutionary ideas. With Darwin, the consensus emerged that you didn't need God as agent to initiate evolution and the development of the world as we know it, the physical
Right.
world. Okay. Now, this is important because part of when I saw Jordan Peterson, I was kind of continuing to work my way through C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles.
Right.
And I listened to Jordan, and I was wrestling with the fact that when I want to preach on the Old Testament or Genesis 1, the cosmology, which is not incidental to that world, has, waters above and waters below, a firmament, which if people do any serious look, I mean, when I was a kid, there's a firmament. It's like, what's a firmament? I don't use that word at all. Well, it's a bowl. Well, what do you mean a bowl? It's a bowl, and there's waters above and waters below, and the world is in between, and the flood happens when the floodgates are open and the water comes in, and God remembers Noah, and he opens the bottom and drains it out. That's the picture of the world that the Hebrews had, and it was in coordination with the rest of the people in the ancient Near East. And that picture is obvious if you read a translation like the King James Version. It's pretty obvious. If you read the NIV or contemporary translations, they sort of start fudging it. They say an expanse, and it's like, yeah, you're fudging that, expanding the bronze where the word comes out of. So I was wrestling with the question, how do we talk about the Bible, which was written in one culture, to people who, so I would get invited by friends to do introductions to Christianity in university classes, mostly secular people. And I would ask them a story like, how many of you think the world is round? Everyone. How many of you can demonstrate to me that the world is round? Oh, we saw that picture from the news. No. Let's imagine that was a hoax. Tell me how you can demonstrate. Now, the Greeks could do it because there's a whole bunch of different ways, but none of these kids could. I'd say, well, why do you believe this when you can't demonstrate it? Well, they don't know how to answer that. So everybody in church
Science,
believes,
man, science.
believes we're on this globe traveling around the sun, but then they're reading in their Bibles about, the sun running its course and the floodgates of heaven. And so I'm wrestling with, well, how can we talk about this? How can we talk about these two things? And then Jordan Peterson comes along, and I'm listening to him and I'm thinking, he's addressing this. He is addressing this. And then I begin to notice that people are, he was renting out that theater for the biblical series, and he's charging $40 a head, and he's rambling for 2+ hours. And if you're a minister, you get complaints if you go much beyond a half hour or so in some cases.
Do you get emails like, I had
Pastor,
to leave.
keep it short. And it's like, why do all of these atheists have so much hunger for the Bible? Because of what Jordan Peterson is doing. I wanted to know that, because I wanted to learn how to do it. I wanted to know why this was happening. So,
well, how he does it is he kind of circumvents the details that would trip up the secular audience and just cuts right to the metaphorical truths, cuts to the chase of the philosophy and the psychology behind, like, for example, the Garden of Eden. He just starts talking about in symbolic terms, which you can automatically do with an atheist who wants to have a real conversation about the Bible. You can talk about metaphorical truths, then you don't really have to care if they were literally, you can start talking about what's the symbolism of the Garden of Eden, what does the tree of knowledge of good and evil represent. That's how I think he did it, but what do you think?
Well, I think that's definitely part of it. Now, for a long time, people have been dealing with this question with what I call concordism. And so you have like the gap theory, or days are longer, all these kind of things that Christians were trying to somehow match an evolutionary account with the story that they have in the Bible. Jordan Peterson does a kind of concordism, but it wasn't quite like anything I had ever seen. One of the things that he benefited from was Jung, because
big time.
What Jung did was recognize that, and Jordan Peterson gets this deeply, we all live within stories. And again, and I didn't see this, I'd seen this before, but Vervaeke really was helpful with the language. We, in many ways, are stories. That's what we are. This physical body is one thing, but the story that is Paul Vanderklay is a different thing. And what Jung recognized is that the ancient religious stories are really vital for the stories that we are, and we inhabit these stories. And, so if you read in Jung's Autobiography, and this is, one of my favorite stories of him. So he's a young man, he's a young doctor, and he goes to work in the nut house. No offense to anyone, but he goes to work in the
Twitter. They had Twitter back then. Yeah. What do you mean?
He goes to work yeah, that's right. He goes to work in the insane asylum, and all of the senior doctors, he's just a young guy coming in there, and they all say, well, don't bother talking to these people because they're all crazy. And Jung's like, yeah, but
what are they saying? What are they trying to tell us, man?
Isn't that why we're here? And so he blows off the directive that he's given. He starts talking to these people, and he begins to recognize, oh, you know what? If we do some tinkering with the story that I am and the story that's out here, these people aren't as hopeless as the doctors imagine them to be, and they can make progress.
Right.
Okay. So now, the thing that I think Jordan did, and I didn't recognize this until he was on stage talking to Sam Harris in the first Vancouver talk, when it becomes abundantly clear that when Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris use the word God, they mean two totally different things.
Right.
And so then I labeled them God number
Sam
one.
Harris means a fundamentalist version, man in the sky, zap you if you touch your wiener, that type of thing. Like, right? I mean, he means like the most, like, that's how I see it. Go ahead.
So again, I've been continuing to piece this together over the last year or so. And so Vervaeke's agent arena relationship is really helpful here, because in some ways, God number one is the arena. It's the story in which we inhabit. Okay.
Right.
And much of the world, that's why I've been hawking this book, or at least the idea in this book. Much of the world has always asserted that that story is impersonal, that there's a meta-divine realm out of which gods and other conscious agents emerge. Now, God number one is that arena. God number two is the agent. Now, in the Old Testament, God is in fact both the arena and the agent. And I get into this in my recent conversations with Brett Sockold, who's a Roman Catholic theologian. And he has some really helpful language in this, because he says what happens, and a lot of this happened in like the 11th and 12th century in medieval theology, is that God, and you see it come full flourishing in deism, that God becomes part of the system. And so when Sam Harris imagines fundamentally a immaterial world and God is like Zeus, every time you hear a celebrity atheist say, well, the Lord in the Bible is just like Zeus, they're philosophically, historically, they're completely wrong, because that is not at all how the Bible imagines God to be. God is
Right.
not like Zeus. Zeus emerges from the void and Iranos. I mean, that's what Zeus is. And the Lord is the Lord is, in him we live and move and have our being. He is the arena, but he's also an agent. And so Peterson is wrestling with the ontology of that agency, but now through Darwin, and even in his Darwinian type of knowledge, he establishes, no, you can get to God number one. You can get to an immanent God even through a Darwinian system. And I think that's the trigger that Peterson flipped. For people, they began then to be able to connect with the Bible in a new way, because he drew that line. And I don't know that Peterson saw that line, and I know that a lot of other people didn't see that line, but that line got drawn deep within the matrix of who they were. And now
Okay.
suddenly Sam Harris's complaints seem far more childish.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it put into stark relief, that the complaints are kind of very, very basic level, like almost nitpicky complaints. But two questions,
Yes.
given what you just said, off of what you just said. So do you think he's helped to see atheists to see the Bible in kind of spiritual terms?
What do you mean by spiritual?
Well, that's where we can get interesting, because there are atheists now. There didn't used to be when I started this 2.5 years ago, who will say to me, "I'm spiritual. I'm definitely spiritual." Like the guy I was in a debate with yesterday. What was his name? Stephen Tiger starts talking about aspects of Jesus, things that Jesus taught. I couldn't believe he was saying this. Normally, atheists don't say this stuff. That things that Jesus taught that he found very compelling, and he also described himself as spiritual. And his complaint was more theological, like the sin and salvation. It's complicated what his complaint was. But enabling the atheist to see it in terms, like if you talk about metaphorical truths, you're enabling him to grapple with some of the spiritual content of the Bible without necessarily having to sign on to, I now believe in man in the sky, theism as the fundamentalist says, something like that. I didn't say it very well, but maybe you know what I mean.
I think what Peterson did was to give the Bible credibility. And one of the things what Jordan laid out was a Darwinian justification for the validity of the Bible, but not exactly in the same way. See, part of the problem with Christians today, and again, this is why Peugeot is so interesting. Part of the problem with Christians today is that they can only think about the Bible in a dualistic sense of what they understand to be natural and supernatural. And that dualism gets problematic. And so what Peterson allowed was that, and actually Rationality Rules did a video on Peterson, because he still keeps harping on Peterson, which fascinates me.
Yeah,
and
he
then there
does
was
a lot.
another guy, I think the guy's name is Destiny or something like that. That thought it was,
Destiny, I don't know.
or I don't know, but it was a video that I did a little commentary on it too. But I think he said it exactly perfect. He says Jordan Peterson doesn't Jesus smuggle. He goes all the way up to the edge and stops. And I thought that's exactly right. You get all the way up to the edge and everybody's like, oh yeah, I'll just take the next step. And they do. And
right. Do you think it was helpful that Jordan Peterson isn't quite a Christian? He's almost a kind of sort of Christian.
yes.
Do you think that kind of helped that whole process?
Yes.
Okay. Why? I do too, but
Because the way the Christian, non-Christian conflictive conversations have been laid out, once you say you believe things like the virgin birth or the resurrection of Jesus, you lose credibility. And so the strange concordism that Jordan has done, which isn't unique to him by any means, you can find many, so let's call them, you can find many people have said very similar things, but by Jordan, in a sense, staying on that end of the line, people like Adam Friended and others in this space are much more comfortable with him. But the day he,
today he starts going, hallelujah, Jesus rose from the dead, they'll be like,
Yeah.
I'm friends with Friended. He's a friend of the channel. He's been on the channel a couple of times. But I noticed that even in my videos. So sometimes go, you used a lot of scripture in that video.
Adam is so annoyed with me because I don't. So he says the thing what makes Jordan so good is he goes right up to that line but never over it. And it's like, yeah, but I live on the other side of the line, Right. But what Jordan had done, which was so powerful, was he constructed all of this on the side of the line that Adam is comfortable with.
Right. And that's very, very, very useful. Because he never crossed that line.
Right.
And are you kind of seeing it in apologetics terms, in terms of like useful for you and I in terms of presenting the gospel?
Yeah.
Because it's helping to stir up the intellect. It's helping people not write off huge conversations about the Bible because they don't believe in, the faith claims.
Right. I agree. But I also think Jordan has surely helped me think in some ways I never would have been able to think in before. As has John Vervaeke, as has Jonathan Peugeot. All three have colonized me pretty good in this
So
journey.
What do you mean? How so? How would you say that?
Well, I don't think I fully appreciated the historical argument for what I would say Christians call inspiration. That in terms of the merits of the Bible, there's been no other book in all of human history that comes anywhere close to its significance for world history. Yeah. I mean, and that's a claim that you don't need any woo to make.
Yeah, inarguably.
Yeah, it's just a fact. It's a historical fact. And Tom Holland, the stuff he's been doing, that's been fascinating me lately. So there's a lot of plausibility that Jordan has brought to the table. And I think also John Vervaeke's project, you're hard pressed I think John Vervaeke, even though he's a non-theist, I think he just completely dismantles Sam Harris and these celebrity atheists because
he totally does.
He just shows that they don't have any credibility scientifically.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what my friend meant. The atheist guy. I didn't think that was a small thing that he said he's not an anti-theist anymore because of his having grappled with John Vervaeke, because John Vervaeke taught him the neuroscience of how some of this is applicable, things like flow state, all that, the actual complex neuroscience. Yeah, it's light years ahead of people like Sam Harris and light years. Yeah. It's, first of all, it's not knee jerk. Yeah. It's not reactionary. No. I hate religion, so let me write a book based on how I hate religion and let me, gather all the evidence according to my precept. Basically what they complain about, they do. His is a really deep dive into mechanics of spirituality with a completely open mind.
Yeah.
So,
and he's also just such a fair conversation partner. I mean, he being from New Jersey, I think sometimes he could be a little nastier because, you know, if you come from New Jersey or from New York, unless
yeah,
someone's a
forget
little
about
nasty,
it.
you don't
Forget
quite
about
trust
it.
them.
I said that to my wife when we first moved out here to LA, because like, I think we went to a fast food place and somebody smiled at us and we're like, God, this is so strange. Like if somebody comes up to you in the street in New York and smiling, you're like, oh,
Yeah, like,
okay.
do I still
What's
have my
this guy
wallet?
want?
You know?
Yeah. Okay, what's this guy want? Okay, what do you want? You're immediately like, you don't trust him at all.
So John, you know, John and the people around him are just jewels. They're you know, again, here's someone you can have a good faith conversation with, and he's going to be generous, he's going to be fair, and I've just deeply appreciated John's John's openness and his availability to me, and so it's been wonderful. And we're supposed to do a conference in September where John Vervaeke and myself and Jonathan Pajot go to Thunder Bay, Ontario. And who knows what's going to happen in September with all of the virus
Oh
stuff.
yeah, I forgot about
But
all
I
that.
really hope that happens, because I've not met either of them in person. And the focus of the conference is really to just give the three of us a chance to get to know each other and to talk together and to engage together. So I'm so excited and so looking forward to that.
Now, do you hunger? Do you think that these people are going to become Christian, given that they're open-minded and they're approaching this thing in an honest fashion?
Oh, Pajot
Like you and I,
already
obviously,
is.
yeah. But I'm talking about Vervaeke and Peterson, because I know you're also friends with Esther, or she's been on your channel a few times.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because she seems to hunger for Jordan. I got the idea that she was hungering for him to become an actual Christian, like kind of like he needs to fulfill that. I don't know.
I think in this space, so this is where my Calvinism comes into play, because I think in this space, I think we have to be careful about expressing our intentions for others. And where on one hand, I do consider myself a missionary, and if Jordan or John became Christians, that would obviously delight me. But there's a certain amount of I see. I think it's finally the Holy Spirit that changes people, not me. And so I am going to, Jesus never said, love only the Christians. Jesus said, love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemies. And so it's Christians, I think, in our context, have to be careful with our tribal scalp numbering. And I think because a lot of people feel, hi, I'm Jesus and I have a horrible plan for your life. A lot of people feel that Christians are just playing a tribal game.
Well, once if people, I mean, you're more like me. First of all, Paul said, I become like everybody else so that I might win some. He didn't say, and to plant seeds. So the sum total of your Christian witness should be interacting, honestly with people and planting a seed here or there. It shouldn't actually be a witness, so to speak, that they actually feel manipulated or you've done something. So you're kind of like me in that, you put that, I don't even know how I would say it, but no, I totally and 100% know what you mean. Once you start smuggling Jesus in and someone goes, wait, he's smuggling Jesus, and then you're suspect from that point forward.
Once I have an agenda for your life that you that you feel is unfair or inappropriate, I have lost a degree of credibility, because now I'm just a con man.
Right.
And I think that's,
well, then you're suspect. And everything you're saying is you're not having an actual conversation with me. You're just trying to route me back to your God or whatever.
So my ability to love someone is not dependent upon them becoming a Christian in a formal sense.
Okay. Interesting. Do you, on this subject, a weird question on this subject? I think you did a stream on those biscuit guys who deconverted.
I've been talking about them.
Oh yeah, okay? I didn't watch your stream on. You put out a lot of content. I watch about an hour of your videos a week. That's about what I have time for. I think you put out like 6. You know, I mean, it's great. I just don't have time to go through all of it. But,
I wouldn't have time to watch all of my videos.
I watched your whole Tom Holland one, and I watched some of them. I watched in full, but so I didn't get your biscuits one though. So what was your take on the biscuits guys?
Well, I sometimes people in the comment will complain because, I'll grab onto someone like Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke or Tom Holland or Rhett and Link, and I'll keep using them. I'll keep talking about them. The reason I do is because I'm a pastor, and these people are illustrations of far broader things going on. And I have watched my whole life people walking away from the faith and saying very similar things to Rhett and Link.
Yeah, that's exactly what I got when I watched some of it. And I got frustrated because it was so dense to me. It was like, oh my God, they don't realize how to them this is like brilliant and revelatory. And to me, it's like, oh my God, you're kidding. Go ahead. I'll let you talk.
Well, and so I want to talk about this, but it's sort of like talking about the virus now. You need a way to help people see it. And so people like Rhett and Link are illustrations. They show the dynamic right there. And so because they put out stuff on YouTube, they're available to talk about. So as a pastor, that's why, when I started, pastors are always reading magazines and newspapers. They're always looking for illustrations, because you can't talk about movements in, let's say, the zeitgeist if you don't look at actual people who exemplify what you're talking about. So they've been a good introduction to post.
It's a useful tool for you to illustrate some of your key points about the deconversion or why they do. So what do you think happened with them? Or give me some of your insights. What were some of the things that you got from that?
I think their deconstruction is, so I've been reading, I should probably get a copy of the physical book too. I've been reading Ross Douthat's book, The Decadent Society.
Oh, and yeah. I always thought it was Dutat.
I know nobody knows how to say the dude's name.
New York Times writer, right? Who used to be in editorials for New York Times.
Douthat. People in the comments section have been schooling me on how to say his name.
I've been calling him Dutat my whole life, and never know if never sure if it was right. It's just the only thing that made sense.
So I think the deconstruction that we're seeing is a natural part of the process by which the church continues to refine and purify and engage the culture around, because they are symbols of where the church has of how the church needs to continue to get up to speed. But now people are going to hear that in a lot of different ways. And for me, as a pastor, that puts them front and center, because for these two guys who make YouTube videos, I know many, many more people who are not thinking exactly like them, but there's enough commonality that the same thing is going through the system. And so
I watched a little bit of one of these atheists, Pine Creek Doug. I watched a little bit of his, about 20 minutes of him, and it seemed to be they almost were right on his page. Like he almost, from the part I watched, he seemed that everything that one of them was saying, he was like, yes, that's totally. So yeah, the thing that happened to them is totally common, and it's standard issue as far as I'm concerned. Go ahead.
Well, and part of the thing that we have to think about is, so this is a point I continue to make often because people don't appreciate it. Church attendance reached its peak in the United States during the Cold War. Okay. For many of us, so I was born in 1963. For many of us, our experience of the way Christianity works in our society is built on that framework, on those assumptions. Now, during the Cold War, Christians were considered maybe uptight, maybe prudish or priggish, but their morality was pretty much in alignment with the general morality in the culture.
Right.
That began to change in the counterculture. And that shift is fundamental. So now we're to the point where Sam Harris can't believe the Bible because the Bible is immoral. That didn't happen in the same way in the 1950s. People looking back at the 1950s, but that change in orientation is fundamental. So
it's profound. It's profound. That's a really good observation. Go ahead.
Well, and Christians have to appreciate that in terms of so if you look at, let's say, youth ministry from the 60s on, so Rhett and Link are also poster children of that, as what they were telling basically in youth group was, you can be Christian and still be cool. I mean, that's what youth groups have been doing forever. You can be a Christian and still be cool. And they were responding to the Cold War alignment where Christians are basically just more moral or more uptight. So you can knock on people's doors using evangelism explosion and say, if you were to die tonight, what would you say to God to let you into his heaven? That line pushed by D. James Kennedy and evangelism explosion makes zero sense in many of the communities in which we live in today. Still works in some, but not in others.
Right,
and
because there's almost none of that 1950s square peg, black and white, father knows best morality. I wasn't raised on that at all. I mean, that was the furthest thing from what I was raised from. And just being like raised as, a secular modern person, you start to crave some of that somewhere along the way. At least there's part of it that represents stability, sanity, peace of mind, and order.
Right.
I found myself in my 20s starting not necessarily craving the square peg aspect of it, but craving the stability, the peace of mind, the orderliness. Like there comes a time where it's just, staying out till 5 a.m. at the rock and roll party starts to get too much and starts to scare you. Because you're like, wait a minute, I'm losing something fundamental. Go ahead.
That's right.
Sorry.
No, that's exactly right. And that's the process that's going on now. Look at marriage, for example. I mean, who's going to be married 20 years from now? The religious and the wealthy. The wealthy because they want to keep their money, and the religious because they believe it pleases God. And they're going to hang in. They're going to hang in there in their marriages.
Right. But the thing about it, though, is that hanging in there is the right thing to do. I mean, that's where it gets really painful. That's where I'm somewhat empathetic to the social conservatives. Because, like, for example, my wife and I told this story on another stream, where when she worked at the real estate place down the street in Malibu, we were the only ones, 50 people in that office, 70 people, the only ones on our first marriage. Everybody else has been married 2-3 times.
Yeah. I know.
Only
I know.
ones.
I grew up in New Jersey. I lived in Michigan and the Dominican Republic, but most of my adult life I've lived in California. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean that, you will not get me to say marriage is easy. I know it. But how can I stay married to someone for 32 years? Well, you know what? It's hard. Well, why do you do it? Well, you begin to appreciate.
Because it's right. You do it because it's right. There's not enough of that,
and your children will bless
people.
You for it.
Right.
If you do it right. And this is what, I mean, and we begin to see this, if you bump into people who, let's say, were raised by hippies, some of the biggest control freaks I know were raised by hippies. Why? Because gosh,
because they start to crave it.
That's right. They needed stability. Please give me order.
Let me illustrate your point. My nephew, who gets along with my wife really, really well, is now stationed in Hawaii as a Marine. And part of the reason why he opted for that, and he's Mr. He's a really good kid. My brother-in-law and his sister, rich hippies. Guy's a record producer and, you know, millionaires, but total hippie, you know, Birkenstocks. She doesn't like Starbucks because it's too corporate, like those type of hippies. like, oh my God, like I love them, but like to the point where you're like, oh, good gosh, you know, and he becomes the exact opposite because you crave it,
Yeah.
you know?
Well,
They homeschooled him for like hippie homeschool. Go ahead.
Well, people have gotten so naive. So I watch couples who decide this is just no longer working for us anymore. We're going to go our separate ways. Everything will be fine. And then they look at their kids, and their kids are, you know, giving all of these signals that the kids are not okay with this.
Yeah.
And people are like, they're surprised. It's like, why would you be surprised? Do you not know what a child is? You know, and you know, self-actualizers are so often just simply selfish. And what do we want from our neighbors and our spouses and the people that we rely upon? We want them to be truthful. We want them to be sacrificial for our welfare. And Christianity has at the center of its faith a guy who dies for people who are mocking him and spitting on him and crucifying him. That's at the center of our faith. And Christians
But the true message of Christianity, though, is that that's ultimately what is going to fulfill you. You just don't get it yet. If you lay down your life for my sake, you will find it. That's the actual promise of Christianity, that if you start living that way and cultivate selfless love, that's where you actually truly find yourself. The way the world tells you to live ultimately leads to your ruin.
Yeah. And
just one note on the divorce, then I'll let you talk. My mom, when I was a kid, I thought my parents had the happiest marriage. It was such a revelation to me when I was like 19, 20, and I started realizing that it wasn't a happy marriage at all. Like I used to tell my sister and I, my sister was like, you were really dumb about it. You know, like one time my mom told me some of the reasons why she never got divorced, but a lot of it was because they were raised Roman Catholic. And I had enough of a dark period in my life where I almost left. Yeah. You know, I can't promise you that I could have been able to handle that if they had gotten divorced when I was in high school. That would have killed me. That would have, honest to God, killed. I was enough of a troubled, drug-addled, angry young man. Without that, I don't think I would have made it if they had. I really don't. But, you know.
Well, and you know, I think your story illustrates another fact, which is we all think in the time spans of our little individual lives, like in decades. The kind of issues we're talking about move in decades. And so, you know, what your parents were raised with, whether or not they kept going to church, still deeply formed them. Totally. And so the blessings of people 2-3 generations back are bestowed upon people who don't know them personally.
Totally.
And we don't understand this about human beings, but it's true. And you know, by the grace of God, people who start their lives living as a train wreck can in pretty short order find, you know, but what do we call that? We call that conversion. We say, I am a new person. You know, that's what we call it in Christian language. They are a different person. And how can someone change that quickly? Well, in Christian terms, we say, well, it's by the power of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Well, what does that mean? It means that someone else has taken possession of your heart and your goals in your life. And you now have a new identity and you're a new person. And that happens by accident to some people, and other people, they try for it. So
happened by accident to me. I wasn't looking to become a Christian when I moved out to California, you know, at all.
Yeah.
At all. So yeah, totally. I mean, yeah. And actually the thing you said, I think is a lot more profound than people realize, that my mother and my father had my mom was in the process of being like a feminist deconverter in the 70s too. She never became an atheist because there was no such thing as like mass atheism. Like if she had turned on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and there'd be someone like Sam Harris, she probably would have been like, yeah, I'm cool with that. Because she had some of the same things. She was raised deeply, devoutly Catholic, and she was having some of the same issues. Like she was very anti-clerical, very anti-church stance on this politics or that politics, but still deeply Catholic. And same thing with my father. And that's a lot of the reason why they never even contemplated divorce, because they were deeply Catholic. My dad still went to church all through the 70s and 80s, 90s, you know.
Yeah. And there's some very interesting studies on if one parent is religious and the other one isn't. In many ways, it's not always the case, but in many ways, if the father maintains the father's faith, that impacts the children differently than if the mother maintains her faith. Those are very interesting dynamics. We don't exactly understand them, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's part of what I think people like Brett Weinstein are recognizing, that, you know, the 50 square peg morality got trashed in the 60s and the 70s, in some ways justifiably so. There's some aspects that are criticized now automatically that the criticism valid. It didn't include people of color, didn't include tolerance for people who were different than the social norm. I get that, that's valid criticism, but there was some sort of stability and sacredness and order there that, I think we desperately need to some degree.
Yeah. No. And so, when you look at Christians can be really nasty to people like Rhett and Link and call them traitors, but I think Christians should thank them for airing their views, because once it's out there on the table, well, now we can talk about it. Right. Now we can talk about it. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about it not in a way that I'm going to crowd you or I'm going to intimidate you. Partly, it's easier for us now because in many communities in the United States, like in California, Christians have no political power and we have no relational pressure. And you hear all these, Christians were using all of their pressure to intimidate. It's like, I haven't seen a pastor that's intimidating for years.
Yeah. That's what I had Drew, the genetically modified skeptic. He was one of the people I interviewed at one of my first videos. And I was telling him, he got it. He was raised in Bible Belt. He was raised in Texas, in a Christian town, all family Christian. But I told him in my town, in Westchester, I didn't know an evangelical Christian. And that is the one thing it wasn't kosher to become. Like if people found out that I'd become a Christian, they would have been like, ew, really? You can become a Jehovah, you can become anything. And everyone's like, oh, that's cool, man. Glad that he's found something that keeps him going, But you become a Christian and someone didn't believe it. They were in the comment section going, where does he live? I don't buy it, Well,
I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. And, in Paterson, there's everything there, So I was CRC and it's Christian Reformed Church, Dutch Calvinist. And it's like, yeah, there's some Dutchmen around. You can find them. The Jews are in Fair Lawn. The Italians are in, Totowa and Haledon. It's just New Jersey's all these little ghettos of enclaves. And then the Puerto Ricans came. And then after I left, everybody called me Arabs. I don't even know where they came from. The Dominicans came. That's just the New York area.
When did you leave New York? Did you grew up there till when?
Till 81.
81. So did you go to the city a lot? Do you like New York City?
Yeah, I like New York City. I didn't go that much. My father loved the city, so we'd go. You go to Radio City Music Hall and watch the Easter show and see the circus. And so Paterson's only, I could see the New York skyline from my bedroom window. Yeah,
Hastings is 20 minutes outside by train.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And both my sisters live in Manhattan now, so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went there. I left in 81 and I hadn't been to New York in years. And then I got a chance to go in 2006 because I had a little pastor's clutch with Tim Keller. And I went there in 2006 and it was like, what happened to this city? Because I left in the old A-Beam days and Ed Koch, and you go to New York.
Where Taxi Driver was.
Yeah, then you go to New York City, and it's like, where'd all the white people come from?
Yeah,
and it's also clean. What happened?
Yeah, Times Square turned into Disneyland.
It
I
did.
remember
When I was in high school, the Christian school kids would sneak out to New York City to try and, get in the peep shows and stuff. And now it's like Disney took over Times Square.
Yeah,
Strange.
totally. And gentrified. It's really strange. I remember
Yeah.
in like 81, I was walking with my friend on like 43rd Street, and he goes, "Did you know that this particular street is the most dangerous city block in the entire world?" And you would get harassed every time you were there. Someone would come up to you and be like, "Smoke, smoke, 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 smoke." You know,
Yeah.
And
So when I went in 2006, it's like yuppies took over this city. What, it looks like Seinfeld or Friends or something. It's crazy.
yeah, yeah, totally.
So you live in Southern California?
Yes, live in
Oh,
Malibu.
okay.
Yeah, we moved here from New York. I met my wife in Purchase. We were in acting class together.
Oh, okay.
It was her idea to move out here. She'd been flying back and forth, and she talked me into it. And I wasn't a Christian then. I didn't become a Christian till the first year after we moved here. There was a little church down the way called the Malibu Vineyard, and I joined that.
Vineyard. Yeah. Well, Vineyard. I mean, Vineyard is Wimber. Vineyard's basically charismatic Presbyterians.
I guess I don't really have that good of an insider knowledge of what constitutes what in terms of. I guess I just call myself non-denominational, because if you say other things, people get all these like, "Oh, you're one of those." You're like, "Well, I guess I'm one of those." Like, what does that mean? Am I? So I don't, I don't even know really. It wasn't until very recently that I had any idea of what actually constituted a Calvinist. It wasn't until I got on Twitter. A lot of this stuff was new to me. All the whole subculture of Christianity. When you grow up in like just the normal suburbs where I wasn't actually religious at all growing up, you don't pay attention to it. I barely knew who most of these people were.
Yeah.
I mean, back now I know some of the names, but I have friends who, like, I'll say Joel Osteen, he'll go, who's that? Like, you don't know who Joel Osteen is? And this guy's a really well-educated, like, he knows every Russian author. He's read all the books of, like, Pushkin and Tolstoy, and doesn't know who Joel Osteen is. It's just, there's a disconnect in the regular culture at large that didn't used to be in like the 50s and early 60s. It's taken hold probably from the culture, what you were talking about, the Cultural Revolution. I'm a child of the 60s, 69 I was born, and I was one of the people in that wave of, parents or boomers, basically.
Okay. Yeah. See, my parents were born in the 30s. So they were born before the war and just at the end of the Depression.
So was mine. But they were, I was born in 69. I was the youngest. So
okay. Yeah. So your family's very much my younger. So I was born in 63. My sister, she was the youngest in the family. She was born in 64. So you wouldn't have been
same idea. My mother was Italian immigrant in the 30s.
Oh, okay.
In Charleston.
Okay.
And my father was from the Midwest, roughly same time periods. They were at college in the 50s.
See, my father moved to New Jersey to turn what had been kind of a mission station to African Americans in Patterson to kind of turn it into a church. And so he spent 36 years pastoring that church. So that's the context that I grew up in. But the Christian Reformed Church has a strong tradition of Christian day schools. So I lived in a Black community, and I went to school with a lot of Dutch Calvinists. And so I've always had a fascination with culture because I was always in the middle of all these different cultures. And as a kid, you don't know it. It's just what you know. And of course, Patterson in the New York area, it's just every conceivable culture around, and everybody trying to understand each other.
Totally. So you were actually raised in a long line of Christian tradition. I mean, when people respond to you as they're somewhat surprised that you're as free thinking as you are, that makes complete sense to me, because most people who are raised within a tradition, like I know a lot of people out here who are Christian, who I didn't know Christians before, and it's hard for them to be free thinkers. Is there a free thinking strand in your particular breed of Calvinism, perhaps? you know how some Protestants are more eggheady than others, and is that potentially part of it?
Yeah, my father was sort of on the left wing of the CRC, but you got to understand that's a conservative denomination, and so there was so after the Second World War, there were a number of intellectuals in the Christian Reformed Church that really did not want to be so insular anymore. So Alvin Plantinga, you might have heard his name.
Yeah, totally.
Alvin Plantinga comes out of that movement. Nick Waltersdorf, Richard Mao, Richard Marsden. So these guys, Henry Staub, these guys were all Christian intellectuals who had fought in the Second World War. Plantinga's a little younger. And they were it was sort of trying to embody the worldview of a Dutch thinker polymath in the Netherlands in the 19th century named Abram Kuyper, who actually became the prime minister of the Netherlands at one point. He was a theologian, and Kuyper had a very interesting story. He was raised sort of in 19th century liberalism, but then as sort of a starter church went out to a church out in the Dutch countryside, and became it's sort of a response to it sort of functioned as neo-orthodoxy, but a generation before. And so this side of my tradition for a long time has been trying to figure out how we can be serious about the Bible and also serious about general revelation and keep those things together. But at the same time, within a denomination that is not going to let you get away with being fast and loose with the Bible. And that's a really good discipline.
Right, I gotcha.
So we have to read contemporary philosophers and science and all of those things if we're going to be honest about the book of general revelation, but we also are not going to play fast and loose with the Bible. And so
Right.
that's the part of the Dutch Reformed tradition that I was raised in. And in some ways that's analogous to, some of what happened in, let's say, the Christianity Today side of evangelicalism. So yeah, the most prominent philosopher that you might recognize would be Alvin Plantinga. And Alvin's younger brother, Neil, Alvin Plantinga's father taught psychology at Calvin College, was my mother's psychology professor. I never had a chance to get a class with Alvin Plantinga. I was able to catch Richard Mao and Waltersdorf and Richard Marsden. So there are others. Luce Meads went on to teach at Fuller, but there's this element of Calvin College and the Christian Reformed Church. One person in Australia, even when I got there, this woman, she was working in the Anglican church there, and she had said, "Oh, Dutch last name, talking about, philosophy and its relevance to the modern world. Of course he's from Calvin College." So this is the kind of stuff that my tradition has always done.
Excuse me one sec, Paul.
Yep.
I gotta get a phone. Hold on.
All right, that's my cue, I guess. Hi, Paul.
He got a bigger name.
Yeah, that's the thing. He's always dropping whatever's in front of him.
Hey, I don't have a video to post tomorrow. Can I download this and post this on my channel tomorrow?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'll do that.
You want us to send it to you, or I guess you can probably just download it.
I'll just download it and post it. No, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. All right, so while he's taking phone calls, I've got some questions for you from the chat as well.
Okay.
So let's see. Oh, there's one from Brett that he's part of our weekly discussions on John Vervaeke's videos, and he's a non-theist. He's curious if you think that Vervaeke's work, and especially his religion that's not a religion, will be able to sort of work as some sort of bridge process between both the theists and the non-theists in sort of moving forward. Do you think there's any, I guess, hope for his project there?
Depends what kind of bridge you're talking about. In terms of, I mean, it's very much been a bridge to me in terms of helping me better understand where many where cognitive science is coming from, where a lot of non-theists are coming from. I've been better to understand it, but I don't know if, so the thing is, once you're in a church, you're kind of in a church. Will his ideas impact people in church? Well, they've impacted me, so probably. A lot depends, I think. A lot depends on what kind of splash it finally has. I mean, part of the big weakness of the Jordan Peterson moment was that Jordan, unlike, let's say, someone like Billy Graham, who was always thinking institutionally, Jordan was thinking like a clinical psychologist who is now working on a mass scale. John, I think, thinks quite a bit more institutionally, but the scope of his project is so immense, it's hard to know how much one person can get done in their lifetime. And that I don't say that to say take anything away from John's work. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's really difficult to form communities that deeply impact people for generations to come apart from a well-established tradition. That's really difficult.
Yeah, and at least for myself, just because like we've been having these conversations regularly, and myself, I'm a Christian, Craig's a Christian, and at least it's sort of providing this bit of language that can be almost used even outside of the like religious context, like still almost like a meta language to sort of speak between faiths that I think could be very useful, even if it's not something like, maybe it is the case that like Vervaeke's won't be able to create a full-on religion in itself, but maybe some sort of like I don't know, like interoperating system or something. Between religions that could still be quite useful.
Someone who was trying to convince us it's going to be a sex cult. That was... No, I didn't say a good one. I didn't say a good one. I just said one. I didn't say like an enjoyable one. I'm back, by the way. I got called up and kicked out of the apartment. I'm now in the car in front of my apartment. I was like, I'm coming home. You got to get out of the apartment. So now,
I think, it's when you look at what finally moves and shapes history, there's so few individuals that do, but yet even the contributions of people whose names are not remembered are significant. And so, it's impossible for us to know at this point in time what work will be important. C.S. Lewis, by the end of the 1940s, everyone had believed C.S. Lewis's career had peaked and his influence had peaked. He was done at the end of the 40s. And C.S. Lewis is bigger today than he ever was when he was alive. So we never know what influence we'll have going forward. So I just think it's tremendously difficult to not build upon a tradition that is fully there in terms of the language, the institutions, the tribal identities. It's just very difficult to start something fresh. And I wouldn't say John is trying to do that completely out of whole cloth. I mean, lately, especially, I'm looking forward to his series on Socrates, because then he's able to sort of take, if you're talking Socrates, now suddenly there's an audience. And so you build from that.
Right.
And I find like what I most benefit from your work, I think, Paul, is how you sort of like bring an insider's look at a religion. Because I don't know, from being somebody that was raised sort of outside of a religion, and now sort of like tentatively trying to peek my way back in. There's a lot of components that are like these ideas that sort of build up about the religion itself that as you kind of come towards it a little bit closer, you realize just sort of how unfounded they are. Like there's kind of this idea within like the atheist community that whatever like heads of a religious anybody in a religious headship position sort of just spouts off whatever they want, and then all of their followers just take it tooth and nail. But
they've obviously never been in a real church.
Yeah.
Jonathan Edwards was kicked out of his church. You look at almost any significant Christian leader, they were given the boot at some point or hated terribly. That's just natural.
Yeah, they were schismatic.
Yeah.
Called a heretic, definitely. John, are there questions from the
Yeah. There's we've got a couple questions coming. And I don't know. I've listened to some of your like commenting on your own church. How you'll have some of those older ladies whose the church life is their entirety of like what they're mostly focused on. It's probably just not the case that you can just say anything and then they'll just buy it. You have to do a lot of sort of working around, I'm sure.
Well, I wasn't here too long, and we did a vacation Bible school, and I was like, well, I'll teach an adult class. And so I was going to do, that was back at sort of the end of the seeker phase. And so I was going to do a workshop on marriage. And I very quickly realized I was sitting in a room with a bunch of women in their 70s, many of whom had been married multiple times, and I was going to talk to them about marriage. They ran me around that room. They were not about to buy anything. I mean, they're not going to let this young kid come in there and talk to them like that. But hey, it was great fun. And some of those women joined the church.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't be smart, at least be honest.
Yeah, that's always good advice. Yeah, and I think that's like in your conversation you had with Adam Friended regarding like the Brett Weinstein sort of conversation. You did a lot of like sort of insider baseball there, and that was really fascinating. And just kind of seeing what the differences are between, especially sort of like this Petersonian type religion, where like somebody sort of has a religion of one. Or like even for Peterson's own case, he became a pastor to a church of one.
That's right.
And the difference between that and actually having sort of a collective community that you can sort of workshop things together with each other. Like you commented about how like different parishes will try different things and then sort of like communicate with each other and be able to sort of like figure out what works and sort of move forward with that. That I just don't think is really there for all these sort of like, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, like when you're actually not part of any sort of like broader community.
Right. If there's nothing you can get in trouble for, you're not really in community.
Oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
That's just the way it is.
Yeah. Because there's no real pressure on you to conform in any way or do anything other than what you feel like doing.
Nobody has any influence.
Right. Yeah, I guess there wouldn't really be any heresies if you're the one making up all the doctrines.
And
totally.
The Church of Me, that's not a great church.
Yeah. What is it? There's like a Mitch Hedberg joke, like I taught myself how to play guitar, but turns out I'm a really shitty teacher. So. All right, we got a question from Mark Angelotti. Of all the tenets of Christianity, are there any that you wish weren't there?
The tenets of Christianity?
Yeah, I guess like doctrines or maybe even practices too.
Oh, hell, that's the easy one.
The doctrine of hell?
Sure. Eternal damnation?
Yeah.
Would you prefer if it was just sort of an annihilistism? I forget.
Annihilationism.
Yeah, there you go, Craig. Or maybe a universalism that was sort of widely accepted.
I don't know if it works without hell, and not for the reasons people think. And C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, is a really fascinating book. That's one of his books that's really gotten dated because he makes so many different references to contemporaries that many of us don't have any inkling of. But the fact that, the idea that God finally saying to people, I won't bother you anymore. You just do you.
Mhm.
And I won't impinge upon you with any of the any of the friction that my creation and my glory within creation um, limits you by. Yeah, that's hell. But is it? When you look in, I mean, if you think about this long enough, you begin to say, yeah, I appreciate the problems with hell, but I don't know that you're so easily just going to eliminate it from the fabric of the theology. Nobody wants to imagine someone being alienated from God, but that is in fact how we are. And yeah, what would I like? Would I like God to move over and let me be God? Yeah, that'd probably get old fast, because I want someone who's a lot better and smarter and stronger and wiser to be God than I am. And that's
Mhm.
just recognizing myself.
Right. And there was something you said in one of your recent videos that I really liked, that like, are there things that God does that I don't like? Like, sure. Are there things that I'm okay with that God probably doesn't like? Yeah, my sin. Like, that's certainly the
Yeah.
case.
It's by definition.
Yeah. All right. Now, I had probably a major question, I think, that is, forgive me for probably not being able to articulate it quite right, but within, let's say, more liberal religious circles, I think there's sort of this uh, openness and availability there to sort of work in conjunction with other religions that are out there. So like in sort of, if you have sort of a liberal understanding of Catholicism, you could be best friends with, say, like a Reformed Jewish person or something like that. I actually know somebody like that, or like be able to. I think the element to a religiously held identity, that if it's held to a strong degree, becomes exclusionary, such that like you can't. It's like wanting to, I guess, convert all the other people that are sort of in your own circles, and which is great. Like I understand like why that's important for people, that to sort of share the same sets of values and narratives with each other. I guess my question is like, is it possible to retain sort of the strong identity within a religion while also being able to cooperate with those of different religions as well?
Well, Paul
I
definitely
think,
does that. So let's hear how.
well,
Because you do that.
I think knowing who you are is foundational for successfully relating to others. If you don't know who you are, you very quickly start projecting onto the other person. It's C.S. Lewis made a comment that I ran into lately, that when he was reading history, when he'd look at two sides that were fighting each other,
Mm-hmm.
what people in history usually miss is the great commonality that these two warring parties had. They couldn't see what they had in common. And so a lot of people who imagine that, and depending on what we mean by liberal, this stuff is really hard to talk about, because I prefer Peterson's openness personality trait I think that's a little bit better than liberal, because that tends to get into political right and left.
Yeah, people automatically think of that as political liberal.
A person who knows themselves well can understand where the lines are between themselves and another person and isn't threatened by the other person. It's the person that is insecure or uncertain of their own identity, of their own beliefs. The person who has a weak self, it's that person that that can't work productively with others, because they very quickly start becoming the other and then realize they're losing something of themselves and then have to claw back. You see this when you watch people who can't get along with others. And if you pay some attention to why they can't get along with others, it's all because of stuff in themselves. So it has less to do with where their beliefs lie on an imaginary religious or political landscape, and probably has more to do with the security with which the person understands where they stand.
So you're not
landscape.
threatened by, it's like, for example, my wife and I don't agree about anything politically, but I'm not in the slightest bit threatened by any of her opinions about politics.
Right.
Because I just listen to what she thinks and I know what I think. So, that's, and it's even a paradox, because in some ways, the more committed you, Paul, are to your Christianity and your Christian cause, the more open you have become. You're less dogmatic and you're more inclined to be kind of an open Peterson-esque, like, hey, let's have a chat for 2 hours about, whatever.
I can think over here because I know where I will come back to.
Yes.
So I can try on other things, and that, none of us are as firm as we'd like, but I can try on other things because I still know who I am. And I was, in fact, the video I'm working on that may or may not see the light of day. I never know with any video, but the difficulty that we see today with people with identity is they're uncertain as to whether there is actually, let's say, a substance or an essence to themselves. And so they're always, they're not pilgrims, they're tourists. But when in Rome and they're doing like the Romans, they think they become Roman. They don't have a foundation, they don't have a base. And I think this is why you will never count out religion, because what religion offers people is a base, and that base is established in many ways by a community. You're not a thing all by yourself. You're only a thing together with others. And in a religion, you now have continuity, not only in a community now, but through history. It's a tremendous advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's kind of the thing too, is especially where people are sort of like losing their, I guess, identity in the here and now. There's almost like this, at least within some young people, a return to the more archaic religions, such as like Orthodoxy or Catholicism, just because there is sort of that history to them. And there's
That's
even
right.
people like paganism is returning, and I think there's part of a component to that where like people want to be inside the identity of their ancestry and their nation, and like their location for where they live. So important to people despite all of modernity, really.
And I think, to go back to some of what Craig and I were talking about, that a lot of that relies just psychologically on your parents and their parents. And, some of it is obviously biological, but a lot of it has to do with, I know who I am. And if I know who I am, I don't have to be you. Because I'm me.
Also,
So
I think a point you made that I thought was really on point is it's the insecurity of that identity. Like, for example, in modern history, Germany became known for its rabid nationalism because they were so late in the game
yeah,
to becoming a nation.
yeah,
In 1871 is when Germany became Germany.
yeah.
And so then you have rabid nationalism in Germany, where England been around for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
People had been English and cultivating their national identity. So
Yeah.
they're really insecure about it. And that insecurity leads to that type of rigid ideology and that fanatical commitment, because you're scared.
That's right.
There's fear there.
That's right. And when you watch, people get really upset when they feel themselves losing themselves, and they don't even know what their self is. And that's what we see happening all the time today with people. And this is why people say, well, Christianity and religion's going to disappear. That's not what the data says.
Nope.
Yeah, it's funny, like how you were kind of mentioning how having that identity strongly held kind of allows you to operate with the other people because you know where you stand. I was reminded of what the highly conservative Catholic author G.K. Chesterton. I think like every Sunday or something, like he would have tea with the Marxist materialist H.G. Wells, and they were apparently good friends, always kind of debating, but still able to sort of cooperate with each other in certain ways.
Well,
it's like famously Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill was the same thing.
Well, and the Jews have manifest this for centuries. In the United States, for example, within in the East Coast, there in the West Coast too, there are very few communities as committed to the welfare of the city as the Jews. Well, I think they can do that because they know who they are. And they're always a minority, but they know who they are, and so they can, they can act with uncommon generosity and often self-assurance. And the one place where they seem to have difficulty doing that is the place where they're not a minority, which is in Israel. So
right. That's funny. Are there more questions, John?
Let's see. Not really so much a question, but I guess kind of a thought from Gavin. The resurrection would have been easily falsified by the Pharisees and Jewish chief priests if it didn't happen. Their silence about Christ having risen speaks volumes of the historicity of the event. What are your sort of thoughts there, Paul, on kind of the historical cases that can be made for the resurrection?
I think N.T. Wright's observation is a good one, in that the best witness for the resurrection is the church itself. And even, Gary Habermas will make this point, even even a lot of people who won't talk about a bodily physical resurrection will assert that something happened to the disciples that led them to go and live the kinds of lives they lived, and their followers and their followers and their followers. It's hard to imagine that this was just a con that they were putting on, especially given the description of the disciples in the Gospels, which is that they're faithless misfits. I mean, when you look at the way how it still is recorded, how and that the disciples didn't record this, but the disciples of the disciples wrote these stories about Peter getting told, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in your mind the things of God." This is the guy upon which you're going to build all your credibility. And, the New Testament just isn't written like a book where a group of conspirators decided to huddle and get their story straight. So for me, for me, how the resurrection works in my life is that you get to a point and you realize that a lot of really common things, marriage, parenting, Christian discipleship, is tremendously costly and is not terribly in alignment with common personal selfishness. And so if you're going to do things that are really, in the thoughts of many people quite sanely, not in your best interest, you need a justification. And the resurrection provides that. It says to me, I don't need to chase money and sex or fame or experiences of self-fulfillment and all of these things for my life, because in fact, what I'm experiencing now is just the beginning of whatever it is that God has in mind for me in the future. And so I can do the kinds of things that even atheists stop and say, yeah, I wish people would treat me that way. I wish people would take care of my uncle who's now homeless and homeless alcoholic. I wish our people would go to Africa. And I think again, Tom Holland's point that all of this got started. We now, as a culture, recognize these things as being sane and praiseworthy because of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think that is because of the resurrection, that I now have justification for doing things that the world would say, oh, that's a really good thing to do. But I wouldn't want my kid doing it because I'm selfish for my kid. And that's how the resurrection functions.
Right. Yeah, that's very good. You want to sort of wrap up there, Craig?
Yeah, we can wrap it up. This was actually a fantastic conversation, Paul. I'm really glad you came by and had a chat.
Yeah, this has been, I told John, I said, I'm going to probably download this and post this tomorrow on my channel, if that's okay with you.
Oh yeah, that'd be fantastic. That's fine with me. And you're welcome back. We can do this anytime you want,
Okay.
Now
Well,
that
thanks.
I know where you live on Twitter, I can shoot you a DM, in a couple of weeks and say, hey, you want to come back and tell me, when you get someone interesting, I'll shoot you a DM and we can chat again anytime you want.
That sounds good.
And you don't really do the apologetics. You've only been in one or two debates, right?
Yeah.
Did you debate? You were on Adam's channel a couple times, just in interviews, I think.
I get frustrated with a lot of the apologetics debates that I hear.
You're a little too expansive for a debate. Your mind kind of works in these long thought processes. It's not like you're not a like, I don't know. I don't see debate as your type of thing. These long, genial philosophical conversations are more where you're at, right?
That's probably true. Although I'd happily talk to Sam Harris or Matt Dillahunty or Rationality Rules. I'd happily have a conversation with these guys. And
you should try to get Dillahunty. Can you communicate with him? That'd be interesting.
I have no idea. I've never had any interaction with
him. He might be into just having a conversation and not having a debate. I could see that.
I'd be happy doing that. He seems like a fun guy to talk to. I mean, I enjoyed his conversation with Peterson. I thought that was good. And his conversation with Glenn Scrivener in the UK on Unbelievable. I thought that was fun.
Yeah, that was good. Glenn was here 2 weeks ago. We had him on.
Oh, good. Yeah. I just finally think, I have a lot of, I feel for a guy, I know a little bit of his story because he shares it. And I feel for him because, and he doesn't feel sorry for himself. I'm sure he likes the upgrades to his story that he's made. But having been a pastor for a while and watched people live, there's just something richly deep and good and fulfilling about having a sense that, this world is crazy and brutal, but I grew up, and especially in the Dominican Republic, you see a lot of people who they're not going to have good lives along any of the lines that we evaluate goodness.
Yeah.
The grim thing I find about atheism is that these people have no hope. And I you know, in the Dominican Republic, we had this crazy thing about, we'd have communion in front with just a few people who are on good standing with the church, and we're all down there on the floor and watching people's feet. And, you know, these people believed in Jesus in ways that I never will, because what was at stake for them
Was everything.
was everything.
Yeah.
And here in North America, you know, gosh, we have it good. And I would have a hard time living in a universe where those people, where their short, hard lives meant nothing. If the universe is like that, I am going to be, I don't know what that would do to my heart.
I don't want any part of it. Yeah, I kind of came to that same conclusion way back when, in my 20s, when I was reading existentialist philosophy. I kind of said that the same heart logic. If that's really what it's all about, I don't want any part of it.
Yeah.
And I always felt deep inside of me, and not in a fake way, but that there's something really awesome and profound and great about life in truth.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah.
Not as like, oh, I hope there is, but like, you know, there really is. And every once in a while, you come in contact with it and are overwhelmed by it.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree. I agree.
And
well, thank you
reminded,
guys.
Yeah, Paul, this was great. It's a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, it's really good. So I'll download this from your channel, and I'll post it tomorrow. I think peeps on my channel will really like it.
Cool.
All right.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, Paul. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.